Good afternoon to you, Joseph.
Hi, Glenn.
Hey, there in County Cork. I think we have quite a few of your fellow Irish citizens listening in, which is really great. It's fantastic to have our first design and dialogue coming in from Ireland. Just to repeat something Lucy said there, do let us know, first of all, where you're calling in from, but also if you have questions for Joseph, put them in the chat box and we will get back to them in the last 10 minutes or so of our conversation. Joseph, how are things there with you at the studio?
Good, Glenn. Obviously, the studio and workshop was closed for a while, I guess from the end of March through to the start of June, and we reopened the workshop and studio in a phased stage then from the 8th of June, the workshop, and now the whole studio is back. So it's great. I've never appreciated seeing the workshop working so much. 2 months of everything empty was rather daunting.
And during that time, were you working by yourself in the workshop, getting hands-on?
We all kept working together. It was really interesting, actually. It was really interesting because for many years, Robert Ingham was involved here with the studio. Robert would have been the principal of Parnham College, Don Makepeace School in England. And he'd been coming here for years, about 15 years, working with my team, developing skills, best practice. And then, as you'll know, Glenn, from being here last year, we renovated a new workshop, moved the workshop away, making away from the studio. So coming into this year, at the end of last year, we were planning to dedicate a certain amount of time in 2020 to, in a way, documenting the best practices that Robert had brought over those 15 years and embedding them to the new workshop and how we'd actually work within that new workshop. So in December 2019, I had put 12 days into 2020's calendar for this best practice exercise, and one of my colleagues, Jonathan, was saying it's a bit ambitious, the whole team tools down for 12 whole days dedicated to this kind of exercise. And so we were discussing how realistic it was. And so then when the lockdown came, we're like, well, that's the obvious thing for us to work on. So the team were extraordinary. They all got busy. And this is quite funny. Some of my team don't like to type, don't like to use iPhones, don't like to do anything. Never mind working remotely on Zoom or whatever. But they all just got really busy. They coordinated the subjects and basically they produced a 300-page book on the best practices within the workshop, which was taking much of what Robert had brought to us over the years, the kind of collective experience here. And so one person would write on a subject and then share it with two others who would edit it. And then that topic would get added to the book, and fascinating. So it's amazing. We're back now with all of this best practice starting to get embedded in practice, in the actual workshop. Things look cleaner, better, projects better coordinated, schedule better. So we made great use of the time, and it kept spirits high and team working together. So,
and that, in a way, also creating a moment of self-reflection and taking a step back.
Yeah, I mean, because everyone was working from home, the coronavirus was something external in a way. They were in a safe environment, and then we just dedicated all the time to that as if that was the most important thing. And it was quite funny because we had no idea when we would come out of all this. We could be still writing about best practice, but anyway, it was time really well spent.
That's a great, in a way, parable of how one does navigate a crisis like this. Well, I know that some viewers will know you very well, but others not so much. And so maybe we should go ahead and start looking at some images, and we have a lot to show, which is really exciting, partly because they will show us a little bit about where you are and where you've come from. So here's the first of a series of vintage shots. I assume that one of those is the little Joseph.
Yeah, so from the right-hand side, my sister Anne-Marie, who's just younger than me, my second eldest brother, Johnny, Jim, and then that's me, and Billy to my left, and Mike. So there's 9 of us, 5 boys, and I'm the youngest of the boys. So yeah, this was a typical day going to a ploughing championships. It's quite a funny, yeah.
And you obviously had a bulk purchase offer on padded vests.
Yeah, everything tended to come in bulk. Yeah.
And of course, it wasn't long before you actually started to find your feet and get into the workshop. Can you say a little bit about that and why woodworking and not farming?
Yeah, so this image is a copy of front of an article about 10 years later. So this is 1995. I'm about 15. And I guess within the farm, while we were farming, there was also a lot of making, just as a practical requirement within running a farm. There was somebody in one building and he would make gates or bale trailers and so there was a lot of that around, and my mom as well in her own way, in tapestries and different things. So it was a feature of life. And it was something that I got involved in as a hobby very young, like 8, 10, doing fretwork. And then I made my first copy of a traditional farmhouse dresser when I was 12. So this is a few years later, about 3 years later, when I entered some competition in the Cork Summer Show. So yeah, and from about this time, basically onwards, I had left school. I was working to commission.
Hmm. And were you, this idea of never using a nail when you were only 15, were you already driven into technically challenging, sort of bewilderingly ambitious projects at that age?
Yeah, I think that came from a point of view on at home, whereby there's this idea that poor things are just temporary fixes and nailed together, and that one should take the time to make something well. And this kind of honest joinery, exposed joints and things. This was seen as the sort of benchmark that one should work to if you can, and the quick fixes really were to be avoided if possible. So I don't know, obviously the journalist hung on to that, but I was focused on very much cutting joints, and at that age it was all about the technical achievement of trying to cut a joint well. That both that challenge and that sense of achievement of a joint coming together well. You've got that extraordinary challenge of trying to do it. But then when it works, I mean, there's nothing greater. You have such a sense of fulfillment that it kind of propels you forward to the next challenge. The image that you're showing here is a few years later. Again, that's about 5 years later, around 2001, 6 years later, sorry. And it's quite interesting because in the background, my first employee, Mark Butler, who was a fantastic character, very skilled, and a huge part of the early years of the workshop. And in a way, here you're starting to see the traditional, so the bench is all these exposed joints, the chair, and I'm working on the front gate of the chair where the tenons, you can see the mortises, where it would be true wedge tenons. And there's the base of a bookcase in the foreground with the exposed dovetails on the end, and yet it's laminated. And the chair that Mark's working on, the background, the arms are laminated and the back is laminated. So I'm starting to pursue these kind of techniques of forming and introducing form and line, but still very much rooted in that kind of exposed joinery.
Was the idea of using laminated wood, is that something that you picked up from existing vernacular craft practices around you?
No, I think when I was about 16, I stumbled on a book in, I think it was the Jeffrey Museum in London, on John Makepeace's work. And I think I brought it everywhere for 5 years. And so, that was a bit of a big gap to bridge, the scale of ambition, and in a way couldn't even identify within his work how it was made, or where that kind of material connection of where he started. He got become so ambitious and so advanced. So that various influences, looking at some techniques in Scandinavia, and then a boat builder came to the workshop one day to use my saw. And he was a boat builder in Kinsale, and it was quite funny. He didn't even have a shed. He was just making boats on the quayside. And he wanted to rip timber and plane it. and he was explaining to me that he was going to laminate, and I said, "Oh, really? And how do you do that?" And so, in fact, that was the first real introduction where I was like, "Okay, I'll rip some timber and plane it up myself," and kind of, try that recipe that he suggested, and it just led me off in this trajectory of fusing that traditional joinery and these kind of formed elements. So the image here is a church very near the workshop, the Sacred Heart Church, and it was first really significant commission in a way because it was the entire sanctuary, the altar, the ambo, chair, bench, credence table, and it was a very interesting one. It's a very old, not specifically this church, but it's on the site of a former abbey, and I was 22, I think, when I did this. And each piece has a meaning beyond its function. So it was the first project as well, whereby I'm having a conversation with the committee, the architect, the priest, about what each piece must express. So it's that kind of, from my point of view, is the first real introduction to what we're calling design art today, where it as an object was more significant than the purpose, the functional aspect of its presence. So they were really interesting projects. I did a few liturgical projects in the early years, and you visited this one last year, Glenn. So
yeah,
that's quite fun with Chris Chang.
So that was you can't really see Joseph's furniture very well in this shot, but part of the making in event that that we'll be talking about at the end of the conversation today. And you'll notice that the pair look, the matching wardrobe is still in effect here. Okay, so you had this idea of a more aesthetically and narratively ambitious kind of furniture. Can you talk a little bit more about the scope and the growth of the studio as you sort of found your feet under you?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge, the opportunity and challenge then became, a commission like that. The liturgical commission there was just Mark and I at that point, and then another gentleman joined us, Alex, another maker. So you were both really excited about the scale of that commission, but then you needed more people, resources, tools, skills. So it became a kind of vicious circle whereby if you were to employ someone, you then needed to get more projects like that. Now, I was very fortunate in those few years that I did receive a few larger commissions. I did a dining table and 20 chairs for the Embassy of Japan because the Emperor was going to visit Ireland in 2004, and they upgraded the dining suite. And there was a few significant projects followed one after the other. But yeah, these are the early days of the workshop. Jan Thomas, German maker, and he's working on the first really ambitious laminated form, the figure 6 chair, which was this idea to make a chair from one plank of wood in a way. And Chris Celine, who works here today, this is back in 2004. So you can see this is an agricultural building, then converted into a workshop. It's pretty basic in these early years, and a huge amount of physical handwork and coming to terms really with what those large commissions would represent in terms of physically crafting them. Yeah, these are the first figure 6 chairs. So yeah, that was the first really ambitious laminated form.
How did you go about securing commissions in those early days when you weren't necessarily that well known outside of your immediate vicinity?
Yeah, well, it's probably hard to relate to in terms of this image is of the potato shed being converted to a workshop. A lot of it was very local, Glenn. So, the church, for instance, would have been a church in the adjoining parish, and committee would have suggested because they saw an article in the Carrickdown. So it was a lot of very local things. The embassy one was quite chance. And then this image here, the psalmist was a piece that I made in 2003, and we ended up making a series of them for a hotel, a small series, I think 6 if I'm not wrong. And it also featured in this exhibition that I organized in 2003 called Create, with a group of Irish furniture makers. There's about 21, and that's the first project that I mentioned to you, Francis MacDonald and I worked on. So I did initiate that exhibition based on an exhibition I had participated in the UK in 2002. So I was already starting to participate in exhibitions outside of Ireland at this stage, and then we created one. This was quite a significant platform for a few years. We did it twice, and that started to really create a lot more awareness of the studio, the work, and it started to get quite consistent commissions, enough to sustain the growing team.
Mm-hmm. At what point did you sort of become, I don't want to put this in a way that's going to embarrass you, but a kind of star in the design firmament of Ireland? Because of course it's a much smaller country overall, and so each sector has a kind of intimacy. And my sense is that already, even at this point, you would have been identified as at least an up-and-coming voice in the field.
Yeah. It's a bit of a difficult question to answer, because Ireland doesn't really celebrate its stars. It's keeps everybody kind of, you wouldn't be getting too carried away with yourself here. No, I'm joking. But I suppose first year you get known within the kind of making community and those that are following it. And then when around this period, this piece here went to the National Museum and we exhibited in Chicago. And then I suppose when the work started to get recognized on an international platform, that of course then was more significant in an Irish context to be recognized outside of Ireland. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I must say, that there's been a great sense of community amongst makers here from those earliest days, and that enabled a kind of platform to get out, and we did things together, and there was a lot of shared momentum in those early years, which was very positive, you know? Mm-hmm.
And the studio itself was growing relatively quickly too, is that right?
Yeah, I guess founded as a studio and company in '99, and now, you know, by about this period, there would have been, you know, this is about 3 makers 2003, and then up to 6 makers 2006. I think there might have been up to 8 or 9 by the time we got up to 2008. Mm-hmm. And then it would have contracted a little bit, not a lot, back to about 6 post 2008. And kind of grew again.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I think is very interesting looking at the early development of your work is the way that you're moving from what I would call a kind of simple curve with the cross section of the piece, as in this one, almost seeming extruded. So you have a sort of simplicity of vector in the design, to starting to think about angles, and eventually, as of course we'll get into, these much more complex compound curves. Can you talk a little bit about how your own compositional sensibility was developing at this early time?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back now, it's quite clear from the traditional reference points. As I was getting more ambitious about form, I was trying to bring with me some of that discipline that applied to the traditional. So I was trying to apply a set of rules, a rationale so it was kind of an incremental step. And it was a tension, it was a difficult period in a way, because trying to apply a rationale to such new shapes was difficult, but I felt like I needed that traditional point of reference. So as you say, they're almost like extruded silhouettes, but if you look at the detail in the smoothness, you know, it's actually at each intersection, there's huge finger joints there, and so very, very crafted. This chair was a plank of wood, sliced in half, diced into layers, formed, and then joined back together on an angle, like so. And you know, naively, I thought I was going to make like this very efficient chair from one plank of wood, which didn't happen, but it became successful as a sculptural piece. It lived on for a few years. We made probably in the region of about 40 of these chairs, a few suites and a few one-offs in different finishes. And this table was a special piece, figure dancing, very much a one-off piece. So the tables in that period were completely one of a kind, because my design ambition was changing probably faster than my making capacity, given the workshop was so small. So the pieces jump quite radically from a design point of view. This was a cabinet, 2006 collector's cabinet, and we exhibited it with the National Craft Gallery at the time in Chicago. So this was really a very prolific period for the Crafts Council of Ireland. They had a fantastic program of bringing Irish craftspeople abroad, and they had a very curated program. Brian Kennedy, a curator based in London now, would have curated a number of very important shows. And this was an amazing period because, I was just in my mid-20s. I was going to Chicago with an ambitious piece like this. I was in Chicago with Joe Hogan, Liam Flynn, Sarah Flynn, these kind of people, and you'd be at an opening, and then you're kind of reflecting on your best. You've shown your best, and we're all going back to our independent workshops, building on that. So that was a very vibrant period, and in a way, some of the younger makers don't have those same opportunities. But we were very fortunate in that particular wave.
Mm.
This is some of those characters in that period, in a way. In the top photograph on the left is myself, Robert Ingham, who I referred to earlier, Liam Flynn. So at the time, we would have a lot of workshops at the workshop, inviting people to the workshop, doing training workshops. So Robert was coming regularly, and then Liam did a visiting workshop once on wood turning. The picture directly below that's an opening in Paris, actually, and I'm in the background, kind of central, and in front of me, to my right is Sarah Flynn, way over further right, Joe Hogan, some of the characters Neil and Annabelle McCarthy, Vincent O'Shea. So, I included these slides because there was a great momentum and there was a lot of, it was one thing to be working in isolation in your rural workshop in Ireland, but to turn up then in Paris together, which was such a different world, with our work, and be able to discuss the work in that kind of context, in that international context, was so valuable.
Yeah. Also gives you a really good sense of the conversations happening across medium, because of course, Joe Hogan is a basket maker, Sarah Flynn is a ceramist, and then sadly, Liam Flynn, great wood turner, who unfortunately we lost a couple of years ago.
But it also brought out a different conversation, I think, Glenn, than if we all met just at home, because it was more evident what was unique, or if there was something unique or something that bound the work. So I included this slide here. This was a very important milestone. This is the American Irish Historical Society in Manhattan, and in 2008 I had a solo exhibition there, which came about as a result of SOFA Chicago, and Chicago architect George Larson attended SOFA. He was working on the restoration of this building and encouraged the society to have an exhibition of my work, which was an important pivotal moment for me. And I was learning everything. The society had never had an exhibition like that before. There was no team or infrastructure in place. It was ambitious. We shipped 23 pieces between works on loan and new works. And I was very fortunate. A friend of John Makepeace's, Mark Bench, had just moved to New York, and he helped set up this exhibition and manned it and everything, and Tracy Causey Jeffrey. So I was very lucky. I kind of fell on my feet in so many ways. But at the same time, the financial crisis happened as well in that moment. So it was a very particular time. I think it opened in September 2008 and ran through November, if I'm not wrong. So it was really interesting and really, really valuable. There was Massimo Vignelli, Jack Leonard Larson, all these characters were coming through, and I was getting to know them. So on the left, you have George Larson and Francis MacDonald and the Prism Table. So that was a very geometric series of work I did. And on the right, the director of the American Crafts Council at the time, myself, and Mark Bench, who helped put this exhibition together, and Chris Cale from the society there.
And by the way, we have Mark tuning in this morning as well as
Okay.
from
Mark.
the American Irish Historical Society. Yeah.
So this was an interesting milestone, not for the reasons maybe that I was anticipating or hoping it would be, because of course, as I said, it was the global economic crisis, so nobody wanted to talk about commissioning furniture.
Right.
So I loan all these pieces there and what have you, and but mainly, and the society hadn't really an audience at that time. You know, it was just reopening. But the most valuable thing that came out of that experience was I stayed in New York for that period, and this chair was a prototype. I was drawing this whole new series of work, and I was prototyping it, and it had been going on for a while, and I decided to exhibit the prototype. I was happy with it in some respects, but also a little bit frustrated with it. And then and then I got totally distracted with running the exhibition. And then in New York for that 9 weeks, it was quite interesting. You know, I suppose it was the longest, most concentrated period on that I had out of the workshop in an international context. So somebody like Jack Leonard Larson here comes through the exhibition, doesn't say anything, but takes it upon himself to write to me after the exhibition. So when I came back to Ireland after the exhibition, I'd fallen out of love with my work in a way. I kind of wanted to destroy it all. And in February 2009, I got this letter from Jack, you know, and he opened this letter, starts, "You're gonna have to go back one because this is important." I know you're trying to get me to pick up pace. But he really was trying to encourage me to, he wrote to me and said, an uninvited letter, and so this was really important moment for me because I was kind of struggling with where I got to with the work and where next. And so I might just read this because, so this is just an extract from the letter. But will you be important in the way that Esherick is in his 2nd century in demonstrating to other furniture makers that art does not derive from simply being without function, and tackle the greatest challenge, seating that feels good in the hand, to be enjoyed by a blind person or Zen master. Doing this will probably require some soul searching, backtracking, and studying the beautiful economy of bird bones to realize that elegance derives from subtraction to the barest minimum. And you can do this because you are young and skilled. So it was interesting. I got this letter precisely at the moment that I was struggling a little bit with what next. And then if you go to the next slide, that's actually the same chair that was exhibited. When I brought it back to the workshop, I just started to carve it away, like literally that evening after reading Jack's letter, and just wasted away thinking about that, the touch, the embrace, really the essentialness. And it was really a kind of a breakthrough moment, and that was the start of the Enigma series in a way.
It's amazing to think about how that letter placed you within a trajectory of Esherick, who was arguably the greatest early 20th century studio furniture maker, and then Larson, who was a dominant figure in the late 20th century, and then you coming along in the early 21st century, almost like a torch being passed. It's absolutely fascinating. Hope you kept the letter.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about the word enigma and why the title?
The title comes from
images from your gallery at the time, Todd Merrill, too, while you answer that question.
Yeah, so that's the work actually that went from the society to Todd Merrill's after that show. The title comes from 2 words, enigma and lignum, and it was really because I was starting to let go a little bit of the control that I was designing into the work in all the previous work. It was very much about control. And the start of the Enigma series, like post Jack's letter, that period, there was more acceptance of what it could become, and more openness to, okay, the material doesn't naturally want to do this, so, but it's suggesting this, so okay, let's explore this for a while. So you know, previously I would draw something and try and detail it on paper and then translate it into wood. Whereas this, I was just putting a gesture on paper and then sketch modeling it and seeing how the material, and then scaling that and interpreting it again. So the form finding became much more physical, and it became much more fluid, and the pieces evolved in the process as opposed to having a set drawing from the outset. So the mystery of the form is in the material, basically.
Well, I like though what you said about having the material do something that it doesn't necessarily want to do. And I feel like there's a movement here away from the arts and crafts kind of honest joinery from which you had started in some respects into something that's more akin to Art Nouveau, a kind of pure sculptural, gestural quality in the work.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's the steps, I guess, from the early work, which I said was very exposed joinery, and then that kind of figure and form, which is very gestural, but it's just silhouettes. And I skipped a few key pieces there, actually, Glenn, in terms of how they evolved. But then I arrived in New York in 2008, and I felt that they were rigid, that the drawing on paper had a fluidity to its intent that I was unsuccessful in translating. And this was a breakthrough by just changing the process. And I started to break a lot of my own rules in doing so. And it was quite interesting in terms of the team dynamic, because making this exact table, one of my makers was almost arguing with me, going, oh, no, but we don't do it like that. We do it like this. And I'm like, yeah, but I said we do it like that. No, it was just the kind of like an awkward teenager growing up and going through those kind of, but it definitely was a different approach to how people were taught how to make furniture, which is more steadfast and step by step. And then it's also because it was that very developmental period. Now we're mastering this a little bit more, and we're able to have a more defined approach to it.
Yeah. One of the things that happened also at this moment is that the sculptural quality of the furniture became more pronounced. And it's very appropriate here that we're looking at you with, well, Gareth Neal there on the right, but also, of course, Wendell Castle, who, you know, is in a way the great avatar of sculptural furniture, and the idea that function can be something referred to at a distance at times, and that this idea of gesture is something that can really find full voice in the domain of woodwork and furniture more generally. And this shelf is such a fantastic example of that. I wonder if you might talk about the place it has in your career.
Yeah, again, I included, this was a milestone. The photograph of us together is in the Museum of Art and Design, the Against the Grain exhibition, and this piece was in the show and subsequently joined the collection from that show. This was a sort of interesting period, the pieces, and you know, it's a shelf, but really its function as a shelf is relatively minimal. And I started to, again, it came from that idea of drawing, like drawing on the page and literally translating that onto the wall somehow. And then the model making process, which was very three-dimensional, working with the materials. Some of these pieces I would have modeled and thought, okay, you know, that works in a model, but how can I translate that into reality on the full scale? And that's where the process was really developing. This series became really important, Glenn, because it had that interaction with the architecture, where we started to get quite interesting briefs, whereby you could respond to spaces. This is a double composition. This is in the Pompidou in Paris. But you know, we scaled these really large, up to 6 meters in India, and did a large double composition in a church in Verona. So it started to get really exciting, where there's this response to the architecture and the space within. So this has continued. It's evolved a lot, but it's continued to be a very important aspect of the work.
And then you were also able to tackle a project of like supreme monumentality in this bed, one of a couple that you've made, where I feel like you really applied what you were learning in those more pure sculptural projects.
Yeah, this is interesting. This bed is 2010, and it was a drawing that existed for years, like years, maybe 2003,
Oh,
and
wow.
then a model which was quite clunky. And then when I started the Enigma series, I realized, oh, I can really translate this bed in a different way. And the interesting thing is that one of the outcomes of the exhibition in New York is somebody commissioned this bed from the scale model, but it was a totally different design. So in the sense that it was in the previous language, more like the silhouette, and then I translated it into the Enigma series. And yeah, it was a very important moment when we finished this piece and it was published. It was one of those pieces that kind of went a little bit viral in that time in the media, and um, yeah, it was again one of those milestone pieces.
You never slept in it, did you?
No.
'Cause
And,
I have to
and
wonder what it's like to sleep, because it's kind of a bed that suggests a race car, but also a dream in its own right. So it really fundamentally reframes, literally and figuratively, the act of entering your own subconscious. Very powerful object.
yeah. This particular one's in the National Museum. It's been donated from the private client in the US to the National Museum in Dublin. So I'm unlikely to sleep in it now, Glenn. Overnight.
Unless the museum sector changes even more than we think it will.
So yeah, this was the Enigma tree chair. You know, this was quite interesting in that you've got this one gestural form, which is the leg connecting to the arms, and then the seat kind of fraying from leg to leg. And you know, you can see I'm getting a little bit more ambitious here in terms of the complexity in a way, and how it can actually create the structure as opposed to having a structure and then a line woven around it. This was a very interesting period.
And also starting to mix materials together, of course.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit, incidentally, about the timber that you use? Are you quite consistent in using the same wood for most projects?
Predominantly, yeah, we're using a lot of French ash. Ash lends itself to bending. It's a hardwood, but compared to oak, it's lighter in weight and somewhat faster growing. Beautiful grain, great structure, lends itself really well to this type of work, Glenn. And I like it as well in the sense that it's quite a humble material in some respects. It's not like a very precious hardwood,
Yeah.
and yet it has these fantastic qualities. And depending on the tree and how you cut it, and there's all sorts of interesting characteristics within it. So, you know, we might use the heart, the kind of brown heart of an ash sometimes. We use different features within ash, like burr ash, and it's a material I like a lot. I find oak furniture a little bit heavy, and I like the weight as well. And so this is literally the process, and my process at least, before it goes to the team, which is just sketching and interpreting into sketch models or little prototype sections, and then if it's of a large scale, it can get. I'll show you a project a little later in the presentation of sometimes it can go quite pure with relatively limited information, two-dimensional 2D drawings, sketch models, and some hand drawings down to the workshop floor and into the making, and then I'll just direct it through the process. And then on the more large complex projects, they get scanned and drawn in a lot of detail. These are sketch models, so you can see the grid, which is used for scaling it up. And it's just strips of wood and wire, and just pulling the material into the composition and seeing what it lends itself to.
Yeah. So 3D modeling in a purely digital sense is actually not that intrinsic to the realization of the complex Baroque forms that you're making, in fact, despite what one might expect.
Yeah, not at all. I did try in the early stages. We explored a lot, you know, the 2009 period. We got involved with the Metropolitan Works in London, did a kind of digital lab there, and we did a lot of exploratory work. But yeah, I found it very disconnected, designing a 3D object on a 2D screen. I kind of needed to get hands-on, and now we sometimes just scan that model, and if we need to interact with third parties like engineers, we'll scan the model, develop a 3D, and exchange that. This
This
is
this picture certainly emphasizes your position within the analog.
this is in France, selecting timber, so selecting the logs to be sliced.
And who's the gentleman you're with?
He's retired now. He was one of the I don't remember his name. He was one of the salesmen for this sawmill called Danzer. I only met him this one occasion, and he retired shortly afterwards.
Well, he certainly incarnates the role of the French timber merchant beautifully. So here we have a few more recent workshop shots.
This is Russell Jacob and I. Russell would have been kind of a key maker during that early period of the Make Them Works. And so,
your team is actually quite international, in fact.
That's so Russell would have been from fairly local, next county, Wexford, and this is Keisuke from Japan. So we've had a number of makers from Japan, and the Lilium screen that he worked on in the foreground. And Keisuke would have trained in a school, Shinrin Takamijuku, which a number of students have come to us from, and they've been an incredible part, in a way, of the recent history of the workshop. Well, in fact, Masaki, the first Japanese maker, came here in 2006. So in fact, the connection is going back quite a while. But it's been a really great change. This is just a few location shots. This is the farmhouse next door. Glenn, you've been in it, and this was redoing detached in 2012, I think. And today, and some of the activity around the studio.
Yeah, it's the thatch is a really good reminder of the rich sort of roux of craft base that you have around you. I mean, everywhere you look, there's something handmade, really, or propagated by hand. In the case of the,
I mean, that house was fascinating, seeing the restoration of it, because a local designer, Rob Jacob, did a kind of reference drawing, and then father and son builder John and Ian Scannell took on the restoration. It was just so organic and extraordinary, understated skill and sophistication without dressing it up too much. Really amazing. This is the team about, I guess, 2 or 3 years or 4 years ago. So a few key people there, like Remy, who's been here many years, Hortense, who you've been in touch with, and Jose Stone Carver.
Yeah. I suppose for you, there's quite a sense of responsibility, because you're really carrying. We talked to Chris Shank, actually, whose picture we saw with me in the church earlier, way back when, in the second episode of the series. We talked to him about the simultaneous sense of a burden and an incredible privilege and opportunity that you have working with this many people, because you really have to keep the volume passing through your hands and passing through the shop to keep it all going. It's like being on a wheel, in a sense.
Yeah, but from my point of view, Glenn, it's it's important because it makes it real. We grew up with a very practical background, and maybe that's why I'm always leaning a little bit towards the functional work as well. And I mean, yes, it's a huge responsibility, especially in times of great uncertainty, but and I'm sure there's more economically efficient ways, but I believe that the intangible part of what we're doing, the world we're creating in the doing, is even more significant than the physical results, the objects themselves, in a way. So I think, it's a big responsibility, but it's also, if it works well, there's nothing more rewarding than working well as a team, and it keeps this kind of reality. This is an interesting one, and this is a 6 meter, 20-foot tall bed, and it's quite interesting because it's for I think you're speaking next week, at the
Yeah.
Fantastic. So it's for Chatsworth House, which was a site-specific response to the view room. And it just absolutely extraordinary context, and we've had the good fortune to work quite consistently there. But it was quite interesting. I made this model of this bed, proposed it. They were considering the Canopy Bed, which you'd seen, and I suggested maybe a more site-specific response. Proposed this piece, and they gave me the green light. Great idea, let's do that. Back at the workshop, I discovered that it didn't fit in my workshop. So this view from above is an extension on the workshop with a 2 meter higher roof. So our workshop now goes along like this, and then up and along, and it's this extension just to realize this bed, which obviously got integrated into the workshop. But yeah, it was a really fantastic
as a metaphor for lofty ambition that doesn't get any more. Yeah, just to say something important, which is that the Duke of Devonshire, who I believe is actually listening to us right now, which is our great honor, will actually be appearing as a guest on the show a week from today. And we'll talk more about Joseph's furniture and how it fits in at Chatsworth there. And here's another photo of that, in fact.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a dining room set of 24 chairs. In this instance, they're in walnut. And ebonized finished. Each one is a unique form, Glenn, all the way around. And here it was kind of an extraordinary brief in a way. And one of the things that I really like about commissioning projects is that you have these opportunities to discuss projects that I could never have imagined, or you're introduced to situations that one wouldn't have anticipated. And of course, Chatsworth has lots of those. So it's a very special commissioning context with a lot of very special art, design, architecture, history, everything around it. So the context is really, really extraordinary. And here, my response in a way to the opportunity of creating something for the dining room was to try and create something that might be like all of the characters, the extraordinary dinners that have been hosted there, and all of the different personalities around the table, and the kind of I had the good fortune to be at a dinner there once, and just extraordinary to see all these artists at a dinner there. And this kind of conversation is such a rare and special thing. So these are like personalities in a way. That was the idea with it.
Yeah, it's fascinating too how that simple thing of the material shift also shifts the tone of the work into a much more formal register, and obviously creates that communication with the existing materiality of the space.
We did quite a lot of prototyping for this project. I think we made 8 chairs, 8 prototypes, one of which, and in fact, which represents the shift in materials. So the last prototype we made, which was in ash of what I refer to as the Duchess's chair, which is the tallest one there, is now in the Metropolitan Museum. So we prototyped in ash, ebonized black and white oil, and in walnut, and studied them in the space. And in fact, the ash couldn't really hold its presence it's such a rich interior.
Too neutral in a way, yeah. And here we see another of the chairs on site, and that's the work of Pippin Drysdale, I believe, on the right, the wonderful tonal ceramics that you see there. Okay, so coming around the last lap here towards the finish, we have a few more images of the workshop here, and I can see that although we've been looking a lot of seating and tables, case furniture has still been part of the repertoire right along.
Yeah, this was a really special commission for a watch cabinet, Glenn. It's an oak pair, and the inner works are all done in bronze. A watch cabinet for 108 watches, commissioned by a long-standing client of mine who collects watches with his son. And so this vessel-like cabinet is connected to a seat that wraps around it for the father and son. Really, and there's a Remy Burr who's working on it. That's the completed piece. So the fumed oak, ebonized ash.
Do you still have in mind the idea of a more accessible kind of furniture that you're trying to create alongside these absolutely gobsmacking showpieces? In other words, are you trying to conduct the studio in such a way that different people can access and interface with your practice at different levels?
I guess I've done different things over the years, Glenn. Like a good few years ago, we started a project called the Adamo, which was a dialogue between disciplines and moments of creation. And it came out of this exhibition we organized in New York, again, that Mark Bench was involved in, called Material Poetry. And in that instance, I stood back from the workshop in a way and thought about the workshop as a skill base. And we collaborated, for instance, with O'Donnell and Toomey, who designed a wonderful wall-mounted bureau desk, amazing piece called Falling Dancer. And we explored that for a year. But it was really a research project. It was something I was very excited about. But I mean, one of my challenges is, I guess I'm naturally drawn into the ambition of pieces. So I would require somebody beside me, like maintaining that discipline, extraordinary discipline of brief in order to fulfill that. Because even with the Diademo project, we had this funny meeting once where John Toomey and Sheila came to see the prototype. And we had done about 3 prototypes. And we opened it up and he's like, where did the copper come from?
Couldn't help yourself. Right?
So yeah, it's a different thing. I guess I'm driven by the expression of the work, the mastery and craftsmanship, and I kind of can't help myself but push further and further with each achievement in that direction.
Yeah.
As much as appealing as it would be to have something like the Diademo project that we did, whereby you're able to create a piece to a more specific brief that is more accessible. And I suppose it's one of the ambitions of the Making In project that you've been involved with us, Glenn, of cultivating more of a local making culture.
Yeah, yeah.
This is an amazing exhibition organized by the Yufuku Gallery that has now changed its name to Kanata in Tokyo. And this was at the Tsubaki Shrine in 2017. Shiba-san, here's the younger priest. His uncle is the chief priest, and the Enignum locust in ash bleached. Very similar. In fact, it came from the Chatsworth Commission in a way. We made 3 chairs for this exhibition in Tsubaki Shrine. Mm-hmm. And the following year, we did another project with Yufuku, or now Kanata Gallery. And this was this was in Tokyo, and this was in a space created by Noguchi in the 70s. Mm. And they wanted to have more of an overview of the work. So a later Enignum Canopy Bed, Enignum desk, dining table, and freeform chairs, and a few other pieces in the periphery. But it was really fantastic to place the works in this kind of context and experience the works in these kind of contexts. Was really special.
Yeah, the way the curvature of your work responds to the rather austere geometrical compositions of Osamu Noguchi is an absolutely extraordinary setting for the work. It's such a beautiful setting as well. One thing this image really is a good reminder of this is that your work often exhibits what I would call a kind of mass customization, where you're taking one form and iterating it in slightly different variations to create rhythm, something that you actually see in nature a great deal. And that feels like a very important part of what you do, that the components shift slightly and you nuance them. So each one is unique, but they also speak to one another.
Yeah, I think that became, again, a very important thing for me in the work in the studio. The materials we were working with are unique because of the year and the circumstances around them. And I felt, if I'm making from one day or week or month to the next, that each piece should reflect the moment in which it was created.
Yeah.
So if it's just subtly evolving, it's a different approach to industrial design, where it's like incremental refinement and definition. It's much more fluid and evolving. But that for me is a very important feature of having a lived studio in a way. The pieces, and it's a risk taking as well, because of course you could meander off in a strange direction. People think, oh, where is he gone with that? But for me, it brings it all alive, and it means we're every day discussing every single piece and every little detail.
We just saw a few pieces, by the way, that emphasize the breadth of materials that you're now working with, including stone, of course, and resin. But let's finish off the look at the work with this finale, which is looking at the extraordinary large-scale sculptures that you've begun making. And here's a deceptively simple drawing to get us into that topic.
Yeah, so the pieces tend to start with these very simple gestural drawings, because it's charcoal and paper, and then into sketch modeling. This is a sculpture for a competition for the National Gallery of Ireland. It was renovated a few years ago. These are some of the scale models. And it was a site-specific response courtyard space, so that's it scaled within the space in terms of a response to the space, somewhere between a scale that is interactive with people, but also responding to space, and also logistically we can fit it in, which was we can transport it from the workshop and get it in, which was a major limitation. In the background here, Peter Flynn has been a big part of this aspect of my work. Peter works with Ove Arup, and we met in 2012. We did a talk together, and we got on very well, and he offered me support if ever I was reaching beyond the limitations of our knowledge with the material. So when we started the Magnus work, we reached out to him. Russell Jacob and I were working on kind of technical drawings of the first Magnus, and our points of reference were a little bit agricultural. So we said we better call in somebody to give us a kind of a more scientific take on this. So Peter got really involved in this aspect of the work, and it was really great because he started to design all these tests to generate our own data around our material and its potential, our material process and its potential. And so now, 5 Magnus projects later, we've been continuing with the tests, scanning them, and then measuring their performance in real life relative to what the engineering firm, Peter's firm, would have predicted. And so this is where the process changes. There's a whole new section put in whereby, I draw, model, and maybe the team work on some CAD drawings, and it goes to making. Here, we build a very detailed, Martin McGloin in this case, built a very detailed 3-dimensional drawing, extremely detailed, down to every nut and bolt. And that then is the interface with Ove Arup, and they start to analyze its potential with the material that they physically tested. So that was a big thing for them, was to generate the data rather than using standard data. And in a way, Peter used it as an educational tool as well for their practice, so that younger engineers could see what it looks like for a big mass of wood to be physically broken, and see how violent that is, as opposed to it being a red zone on the screen. So that whole collaboration has been really rich. This is just details. Well, Martin wouldn't call it just details. A lot of drawing of all the little components within the mounting plate. With this piece, it's all free form except where it interfaces with that engineered metal component in the previous slide and the concrete where it meets the building. So this is the one place where we need a really refined control of the form. So you can see in this aspect of the work, the jig making and form building is far more significant in a way in terms of its presence than the resulting object. Yeah. It's like, but yeah, this whole project, this is that going from the controlled into the free, which we'll see probably in one of the next slides.
And amazing that it's actually still done with hand clamps, by the way.
Yeah.
The precision of the tension. And here we begin.
There are some of the components apart. Yeah, and it's kind of carved out to accept the curved metal plate, which is housed within those inner and outer forms. This was the start of that move as well, Glenn, from the studio and workshop where it was originally to that new workshop that you now know. This is the new workshop in that transitionary stage where we just physically couldn't make that object here. So we're like, okay, let's go and move over to that other big building, and that led to that whole renovation. This is Remy Burr again. So, a lot of very much handcrafted kind of carving out for all the bolt fixtures and things. This is Jose, who's a stone carver and would have worked on those marble pieces, but would have got involved in the sculpting of this work because it's sculpting on such a major scale, of course. Yeah, it was quite fun, bringing a spider crane into the workshop to lift the object around things.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say it's an amazing combination of different levels of technology, and from the most sort of fundamental woodworking craft that you would have been practicing when you were 15, into the dizzying complexities of engineering that the folks at Arup are bringing, and then the scale of the equipment that you're using, but it's still using hand clamps and hand tools.
Yeah, I suppose an element of that, Glenn, as well, is the fact that, we're talking about one of a kind pieces. So it's a unique object. It's very developmental. There's a lot of problems solved in that one object. So, the other ways one might approach this would involve a lot of tooling, a lot of programming, if you're going digital, a lot of etc. So, it goes back to the point we we're making earlier about each piece being of that moment. It is still very much a physically realized object, both from the design development or concept through to the actual making.
And here you're installing it in site, obviously.
Yeah. That was quite fun. It was funny. As an Italian sculptor was visiting here, who works on a monumental scale, his whole career, and he saw that last picture. And he said to me, this is your first large scale work, right? And I was like, yes. Why do you say that? And he says, well, there's 10 of you. I install mine with just a truck driver.
That's hilarious. A lot to learn still, right?
Yeah.
Here we have a
in situ, and there's a short film here that just captures a little bit of the place and making of that piece. This is the farmhouse and the original workshop and studio, which is now just a studio. This is Hortense. At some point here, you'll see the wood that has been cut into thin layers and then joined over the length to create these 30-meter long lengths of wood, which are here coiled. So the material preparation, Glenn, to get to that point is really significant. You're selecting about 5 trees, sawing it about 2 inches thick, drying it, gluing it all back together, taking out the defects, gluing it all back together, and then re-sawing it into these layers, and then jointing it over the length. It's a huge thing. This is some of the jig work set out, and Shogo and Remy here working on the dry run. So they're interpreting the models and seeing how the material will adapt on the full scale. And this is the team then starting to lay out the actual layers, apply the adhesive between. And then introducing it into the former, clamping it. So the design development here, most of it really is around the jig work. And this was one, you can see it's really dark and late at night. I mean, we started really early. Just the forming that day was, maybe it was like a 16-hour day or something. And then standing it to study, look at the kind of structural aspects of it before entering into the final carving phase.
What's the total weight of the sculpture, Joseph?
From memory, Glenn, I think it's around 600 kgs. Ash is a pretty light wood. A lot of the weight's down there in the base, and the metal engineering. There's a curved metal plate that goes about 1 meter long that's inserted into the sculpture.
So Joseph, I'm afraid to say we're sort of running out of time here. I wonder whether you would be okay with finishing up here with this video and taking just a couple of questions from the audience. Okay, great. I think we do have at least a couple. We have one actually from Helen Drutt, the great gallerist here in New York and Philadelphia, that I'll just read out. She asked, do you consider John Makepeace and Parnham House your embryonic roots? Which is a nice question.
Certainly when I discovered the book on John Makepeace's work, I was, I had an ambition to do something more than I was aware of up until then. And then discovering that book, it was like, it was a discovery of work I never had any other reference point of, or didn't know anything could exist like that. So yeah, it was certainly something that made that ambition seem like something one could realize or live up to, or didn't. So yeah, it was definitely a huge catalyst.
Yeah. And again, amazing to think about the trajectory back through someone like Makepeace and then back to Escherich. So there was a kind of continuing story being told here. Richard Odell asks, how many designs never make it to fruition, and how many of those come back in another form later?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. Yeah, it's a cycle. I suppose you generate 6 times as much material, or 20 or 600 times, I don't know, like so much more than you actually realize. But by working with sketch models, and you've seen the workshop, Glenn, I kind of keep them pretty present, because I find on the route to one design, you discover some other interesting things, and I keep them around me, and they just become part of that library, and they come back to life, maybe even in a different form. But yeah, any good idea, I think I try and just say, okay, let's keep that on the wall, and it'll have a relevance somewhere else for sure.
Right. Okay. And then just last question we have time for, which is, do any of your family work with you in the studio?
No.
But the studio is a family of sort, and
Yeah.
We thought we might actually finish up by trying to show the inside of the studio and the team there, in case they want to wave hello, say hi. Can we try to do that?
Let's see.
Say unmute. That should work.
No.
Hello.
Hey, Laura.
Hey, how are you, Glenn?
Good, good. Is that the sound of the studio? We can't see you.
It's not quite the sound of the studio, but it's relatively quiet these days, Glenn, for sure. At the moment, apart from lots of the birds in County Cork.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Are we able to get a shot of the inside of the studio before we close?
The rest of the team,
We're
Laura's
at the workshop.
Let's see if there's one or the others.
I think Gabriel is about.
Unless you want to play that last video, Glenn, which
Sure, to do that, yeah. Let me play the last video to close us out. And before we go, I'll just also announce that next time on Wednesday on the show, we're going to have the great curator calling in from Berlin, Matilda Krzyzkowski, who's going to be joining us. Really inventive and energetic curator who's really reinventing the terms on which the public meets with contemporary design. So do come back for that. And let's just finish off here with one last video from Studio Walsh. I'll just do that. Congrats.
Gabriel at the workshop.
There's the
okay, great.
Yeah.
This is
Here we go. Thanks, Joseph.
Thank you, Glenn.
Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties here.
Down at the end of this lane in County Cork, there's something exciting going on. The soul of the place is conducive to this kind of conference.
What Joseph does is quite amazing. So to see 400 people in a room listening to these amazing craftspeople from all over the world, I think is quite incredible.
I really think the event should be called Fearless, because all the people involved are doing things they've never done before.
The panel of people talking is extraordinary.
One of a kind, and the uniqueness of what's presented here. Never experienced that before.
We see the earth as client.
It is bringing so many creative minds together.
I'm so happy to be here. It's been probably the best decision of my year so far.
To listen to the dialogue, to understand that element of passion, the creativity.
I'd be surprised if somebody wouldn't be inspired by coming here.